in about 1975, part of the beach that runs right up to the fence of the inner German border, within sight of what was then a huge watchtower, was turned into a nudist beach, whilst nobody was allowed on the beach on the East German side apart from border police with binoculars.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Good evening. The stunning overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by communist hardliners dominates the news this Monday.
The Chinese army, the Chinese police are advancing through the city from a variety of directions on Tiananmen Square.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you subscribe in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Tim Phillips travelled the route of the Iron Curtain from deep inside the Arctic Circle to the meeting point in Armenia, Azerbaijan and Turkey. On his journey, he explored the surviving traces of both the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. The people he meets bear vivid witness to a time of change. There are some who now look on the Cold War with nostalgia and affection, but many more who still despise it, unable to forgive the hard and sometimes lost decades that their families, friends and nations had to endure. Strikingly, a large and growing proportion of these populations no longer has any personal memory of this defining 20th century conflict. They were still too young or not even born when the curtain and the wall came down. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a written review in Apple Podcasts or share us on social media. By telling your friends, you can really help us grow the number of listeners. And if you can spare it, I'm asking listeners to contribute at least $3 per month to help keep us on the air. Larger amounts are welcome too. Plus, you get that sought-after Cold War Conversations drinks coaster as a monthly financial supporter, and you bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. So, back to today's episode. We welcome Tim to our Cold War conversation.
It was a combination of a project that I personally had always wanted to do for a long time, and something that eventually I thought would make a good book, especially at the moment that we're living through at the present time.
Yeah, why did you decide on this particular sort of subject for your journey?
So I've spent a long time in my life researching Russia and particularly contemporary Russian politics, and I've always been fascinated by the Cold War, both the reality of it and the fiction of it. I decided that, well, as I say, it had always been a personal interest of mine to go to places where there were vestiges of the Cold War, where important events had happened. And then I guess I found myself thinking about some of the new divisions in the world that are coming up increasingly at the moment, and the fact that some people, me included, feel that there are certain similarities with the Cold War past. And I kind of put the two ideas together, and I had some time off my normal job, and I decided I was going to try and make the journey and write a book about it. I guess the thing that the big decision I made early on was that rather than just traveling on the route that is very famous, so from the Baltic coast of Germany down to Trieste, Churchill said from Stettin to Trieste, but that was actually inaccurate even when he said it. Perhaps we can come back to that. Anyway, rather than just going from the top of Germany down to Italy, I decided I would try and do a more genuine trip along the whole of the old East-West divide in Europe. So I started at the top of Norway in the Arctic Circle, where Norway and Russia touched each other, and made my way all the way to the easternmost part of Turkey, where it meets Azerbaijan.
You know, there were only two places where NATO countries directly bordered on the Soviet Union, which I think was Norway and Turkey, which are the two northernmost and southernmost points of your journey.
That's exactly right. So that was kind of my organizing principle. The most northerly place is the nearest settlement is a place called Kirkenes in Norway. There isn't really an equivalent place just across the border in Russia, though the nearest city is Nikel, which is quite a large place. So I started there and then wended my way down through Europe during last spring and summer, and a little bit in the autumn as well. But not all on foot, as several people have asked me, because I think I would still be walking. So lots on foot. I did walk 1,000 miles, slightly more than 1,000 miles during the trip, but I covered the rest of the 15 or so thousand miles using other modes of transport.
Wow. And Kirkenes, is it pronounced, did you say?
Yes, Kirkenes. Interestingly, the people there seemed to turn the first K into a sort of a sound a bit like a Russian H. So Kirkenes, many people seem to say, but...
Right. Well, regular listeners will know that pronunciation is not my strong point. But I do know that this area was liberated by the Soviet army at the end of World War II.
That's right. And actually, that had a very big bearing on how people in Kirkenes and in Finnmark province generally approached the Cold War, and indeed how they continue to approach relationships with Russia today. So won't be a surprise to your listeners that many people on both sides of the Iron Curtain felt that Russia was a dangerous, frightening, or Soviet Union, we should say more accurately, that the Soviet Union was a dangerous, frightening aggressor, an occupier in many parts of Eastern Europe. That's certainly how it seems to many local populations. Interestingly, the Norwegian population in the far northeast of Norway, they have a healthy respect for the Soviet Union and for Russia, but also a lot of gratitude for the liberation from the Nazis.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I guess, because it is one of these areas of Europe which the Soviet Union occupied, where they did actually withdraw from. Whereas, obviously, with most of Eastern Europe, it wasn't until 1990s and 91 that they started withdrawing from those areas. Do you think that's in some way because something that sort of makes these people have a slightly different viewpoint?
Definitely. The Russians came, they liberated the place, and they left again. I guess, to mix my Scandi country metaphors, one could say that there is a certain amount of Stockholm syndrome, in the sense that the people there are very aware that if the Russians wanted to, they could be over the border and occupying the very sparsely populated area before the NATO troops several hundred miles to the west and the south had mobilized themselves. So I think it's a bit like... Perhaps it's a little bit like having a troublesome neighbor who other neighbors tell you can get violent and nasty, but they always smile and wave at you. So you make sure you always smile and wave nicely back.
Yeah. Have you ever seen that series? I think it's on Netflix, called Occupied.
Yes, I watched the first series of that. I haven't seen the second. Quite a striking storyline.
It is, and I wondered whether what the sort of Norwegian view is on that film, that it's just good fiction, because it's shades of the Ukraine with the little green men turning up, or Crimea, but sort of set in Scandinavia. I found it a really good series, and the second series is well worth watching too.
I think there is more than a grain of truth in it. When I say that people in Finnmark, in Kirkenes, are kind of well disposed towards the Russians and feel that Norway in general should tread carefully when it comes to Moscow and not unnecessarily make an enemy of it, that's not necessarily the view in Oslo.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think your next stop was another country in Scandinavia that has an interesting relationship with the Soviet Union, in Finland. Yes.
This was something. There were many things in planning the trip that I knew about and had kind of, as soon as I decided I would do it, I thought I'm definitely going to go there. I'm definitely going to see that. Obviously things like Berlin, but also the Vienna, which used to be divided in the same way as Berlin. But there were other things that I really had no idea about, and I thought, well, I'm going to go to Finland, and I wonder what I'll see. I think you're probably referring to Porkkala, the part of Finland which is nowhere near the old Soviet border, but which nonetheless the Soviet Red Army occupied for 10 years after the Second World War.
Finland's position is an interesting one because in World War II, it's initially seen as a victim of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union attacked them in 1939. Finland has to sign an armistice, loses territory to the Soviet Union, but then attacks the Soviet Union alongside the German army in 1941, gains quite a lot of territory in those early years, but then is eventually beaten and has even more stringent peace terms imposed on it, of which Porkkala was one of them.
That's precisely correct, yes. Finland, not to excuse any of the specific indefensible decisions that governments may have made, Finland is one of those places that very unfortunately entered the war off the back of the Nazi-Soviet pact, and therefore could never really put itself on the right side in the war. Basically, it saw the Soviet Union as an aggressor because it had kind of been carved up in the pact between Stalin and Hitler. And so then at a later point, when it might have decided that it would rather be with the Allies, since the Allies also included the Soviet Union, that wasn't an option for it. Similar thing for, non-pro-communist forces in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. As I say, not to excuse specific bad decisions, but just to recognize that they found themselves between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, and they also lost the equivalent of England losing Birmingham, didn't they? Finland's second city, Viipuri, was lost to the Soviet Union as well.
That's right, and actually, Viipuri, or Vyborg, as the Russians call it, is one of the places I went to in Russia in order to see what the vestiges of Finnish culture are there, and also kind of what happened to those during the Soviet period. It was a huge loss. It also was a very important place for Sibelius, and Karelia more generally was a very important place for Finnish culture across the board. So it was like losing a heartland, both economically because it was the second city, but also then in terms of Finnish culture. And what's very interesting is at the end of the war, when they signed peace accords, everybody who is Finnish in Vyborg and Viipuri, they leave, and instead a new Russian-speaking population largely from the Urals, but also from other parts of Russia, they're brought in. So with no connection to the place, no connection to its history, and they start to build a new story of Vyborg. So that's a really fascinating kind of element of this, and it's not formally a closed city in Soviet times, not like some of the ones that are closed because they have nuclear industry or something like that, or big military presence, but because of its proximity to the border, it was effectively very difficult to visit, and Finnish people, for instance, could go on a day trip there from until the late 70s, but they could not spend a night in Vyborg.
Right. And were there many vestiges of Finnish culture left there, like in the architecture?
Yes, I mean it had been a Swedish city at an earlier point, and there are some late medieval Swedish and Finnish buildings. A wonderful castle that anyone who's ever taken. Not very many people have been to Vyborg, but perhaps some of your listeners have taken the train in their lives from Helsinki to St. Petersburg or Helsinki to Leningrad. as you pass through Weborg, you get a very spectacular view of the castle, the fortress, which is really magnificent. Then there are quite a lot of lovely, what would you say, commercial buildings and banks that date from the late 19th and early 20th century, and they tend to have writing in Finnish, English, French, Russian sort of inscribed on them because it was a big commercial port. And then rather marvelously, and I don't know if this is what you had in mind, I don't know if you were aware of this, there is the really splendid Alvar Aalto Public Library, designed by Alvar Aalto, one of the most important modernist architects in the world, the most important probably in Finland, in the 1920s, and then realized through to the mid-1930s, a splendid kind of white box with beautiful windows letting in lots of light and an amazing functionalist interior with skylights and beautiful Karelian wood rails running around it, and a really magnificent building. So that was left. It only operated as a public library in peacetime for 3 or 4 years before the Winter War began. And it was left after the war in a quite dilapidated state, and only repaired properly after Stalin's death. It actually had a very lucky escape because although it would not have looked out of place in some Soviet visions of the future circa 1922-23, by Stalin's time, as many of your listeners will know, it was neoclassicism that was all the rage, and we can think of those sort of Stalinist birthday cake style buildings in Moscow. And when they drew up plans to try and renovate it in the late Stalinist era, so late 40s, early 50s, the plan was to give it columns and a portico and stick some stuff on it to make it look more neoclassical, a bit more decent, which would have utterly ruined it. So very fortunately, that never actually took place, and it was repaired in quite a good way in the late 50s and reopened as a library in the 1960s.
I mean, Finland is an interesting case because there's this term coined Finlandisation during the Cold War, where as part of their treaty as well, I think they are not able to join NATO and they have to remain neutral.
I lived in Finland about 15 years ago when I was finishing my doctorate, and I began to pick up then from conversations with friends that they had a very cautious attitude towards the Russians, and they looked on the period of Finlandisation, so the period from 1955 through to the end of the Soviet Union, as a period when Finland had to make some very difficult choices, some very difficult compromises. But they generally felt, whether these were people on the left or the right of politics now, they generally felt that really Finland had had no choice. And so actually, governments that had made these difficult trade-offs, not to criticize the Soviets, to buy things from the Soviet Union, even though it might not have been what they wanted, to censor publications in Finland sometimes because otherwise it would have displeased the Soviets. They looked on these decisions as being simply what was inevitable if you're a small country and you have beside you a potentially hostile, enormous country. Going back to the origins of Finlandisation, as I discovered on the trip, there was a moment in the middle 50s, Khrushchev's established himself in power, and he is aware of the unsustainable military cost of maintaining the hostile position of the Soviet forces across Europe, and particularly in many outposts where there was no longer any prospect that they were going to turn the local population communist or something like that. And in order to try to retrench, he thinks of this policy whereby he will cut a deal with the local population, the local governments, that he will leave, the Russians will leave, so long as the countries agree to be neutral and not to join NATO. And that's kind of the germ of what is pejoratively known as Finlandisation. It happens in 1955-56 through negotiations with the Finnish government. It also happens at the same time with the Austrian government. And basically the same deal is cut there. The Russians withdraw from, the Red Army withdraws from the Soviet quarter of Vienna and the Soviet quarter of Austria, and in return the Austrians agree never to join NATO. People don't, for some reason, talk so pejoratively of the fact that it happened in Austria, but it was broadly identical. And there was a kind of plan, not fully welcomed in all Soviet circles, and certainly not welcomed in East Berlin, but there was a plan in the minds of some in Moscow to do exactly the same with Germany. That if the West agreed to reunify Germany, as had been done with Austria, so long as Germany as a whole agreed to be neutral, the Russians would have left, and effectively they would have left the East German communist regime to the mercy of events. But it never took place.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So moving further down the Iron, well, not exactly the Iron Curtain, but you get onto Latvia, which is an interesting place. A former Soviet state.
Yes. There is, people don't write very much about the maritime Iron Curtain as I think of it, but it was nonetheless a reality. And in fact, the importance of navies and submarines to the Cold War on both sides, and also the significance of the fortifications along the beaches, along the coastline of the Baltic republics and elsewhere, mean that it really is appropriate to think of the Iron Curtain going through the Baltic Sea. Yeah, I went to Latvia. I think I was particularly drawn to a place called Liepaja, which is on the west coast of Latvia, and which was a major Soviet naval port. I guess it's just another short illustration. Liepaja and its suburb Karosta, which was where all of the military people lived and where the barracks were and the submarine base. That was a proper closed city, and this, what really brought that home to me was in the excellent prison museum there, in what used to be a military prison. They have maps that show Liepaja as it appeared on Soviet cartography, which is basically as some marshland, no settlement there at all, and specifically the bit with the big military harbour in it and the military city, that is actually on the maps an extension of the Baltic Sea. So the land itself has been disappeared on the maps. That's the extent to which it was hidden from view.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, I've seen old British Ordnance Survey maps which just have gaps in them for some Cold War military locations, but I've never heard of a base disappearing into the sea like that.
I know. When you they have it nicely set up in the museum so that you can just look at an ordinary map of where you are, and you have to look several times to sort of work out where the outline is on the one map and where it isn't on the other, and that they've actually put it in as some sort of shallow waters rather than being a large city with 40 to 50,000 people in it. Yeah, really remarkable.
And you also visit some of the islands in the Baltic as well, namely Gotland and Bornholm.
Yes, I went to both. They are the most easterly parts of Sweden and Denmark, respectively, and they really are quite far east compared to those two countries. Gotland, in particular, was very implicated in the Cold War. Sweden, obviously, not in NATO, but having to take large steps to defend itself, and it was felt, I believe, from the 19th century onwards, so not just in Cold War times, that Gotland, there's such a concept as the Gotland Gambit. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but the Gotland Gambit is that whereby a power like Russia seizes Gotland, because it wouldn't necessarily be very difficult to seize. It's quite small and quite isolated, and holds it as ransom, effectively, for some other thing that it wants from the West. So basically, that's quite like, I believe, the plot of Occupied, the Norwegian serial that we talked about. So basically, Gotland would find itself invaded, and the West would be told in return to back off from some other part of the world, or else Gotland wouldn't be released. In Soviet times, it was more likely, in Cold War times, it was more likely that that would be the first step of some kind of attack on the West. So there was quite a lot of the population of Gotland was about 50% bigger in Cold War times because of the military presence there. And quite a lot of steps were taken to try and keep track of what the Soviets were up to. From people I talked to when I was there, I'm not sure anyone had much hope that all of the military buildup would have achieved much in the way of keeping Gotland Swedish if the Soviets had wanted to take it. But the reality was instead that actually there was no direct attack on Gotland, and it became more of a place that when people got the chance to escape from the Soviet Union, whether that was in crop sprayer planes or purloined naval vessels, Gotland often was the place they headed for, because it was the nearest point from the Baltic coast.
Right. And I've heard similar with Bornholm. I've seen various photos of various Polish MiGs landing on Bornholm to defect. But obviously Denmark was part of NATO during this period.
Yes, so you can go. A great day out is to go to the old NATO listening station on the east of Bornholm, so the bit of Bornholm that's closest to Poland, Soviet Union, Germany. And it was, you can see the technology that they used to listen to the signals traffic in the east. And in the same museum, they have one of the MiGs that the Polish pilots used to escape in, and so you can touch it, walk around it. Really marvelous.
Because again, this was an area that was occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, and then they handed it back, didn't they?
That's right. They stayed for a year. They didn't call it an occupation at the time. The Danes have always been very careful not to call it an occupation, because that was one of the conditions of the Soviets leaving. There's a beautiful Soviet military cemetery there, and the Soviets still come every year and lay wreaths until the recent problems between the Old West and Russia. The Danes would also mount a military guard in respect for the fact that Bornholm was liberated by the Red Army. But I believe that they no longer are doing that at the moment, because there is a freeze on all relations between all military cooperation between Denmark and Russia since the annexation of Crimea to Russia. But it's a military cemetery in a truly beautiful spot looking over the Baltic Sea, and I believe that it was a reasonably friendly and amicable situation, and also that it was pretty clear throughout that there wasn't really much intention on the part of the Soviets to try and hold on to Bornholm. They recognized they had only got hold of a very small part of a much bigger country.
Were you not tempted to go to Kaliningrad on your way down?
Very tempted. And it may indeed be something I try and do before the book comes out. I guess there were two parts of the trip where I could have taken an absolutely exhaustive approach, and I decided that I wouldn't, simply because of the time available to me, and I run the risk, therefore, of being accused of kind of not doing justice to some of the fascinating stories. One of them was that Baltic coastline, where obviously I also did not, on this trip, visit Estonia and Lithuania, and you're right, Kaliningrad. I didn't go to Poland too, which had a Baltic coastline, though in terms of its land borders, it was well behind the Iron Curtain. And then in the Balkans again, I didn't exhaustively go through all of the former Yugoslav republics that bordered Western capitalist countries, and I didn't visit Bulgaria. So, yeah, I think that's a legitimate challenge, but so far I haven't made it to Kaliningrad.
Well, Tim, you want to keep some back for a second book, surely?
That's true. Or perhaps I'll do the Caribbean Iron Curtain or something.
Yeah, well, you've heard of Ernst Thälmann Island off Cuba?
No.
Which the Cubans donated to East Germany during the Cold War. A bust of Ernst Thälmann was erected on the island. But the interesting story is apparently when German reunification occurred, West Germany wasn't aware of this island. And so the story goes that technically it's the last surviving piece of East Germany.
So has it remains with Cuba in a kind of cryogenic state awaiting the return of the GDR?
Well, yeah, in theory, I think, Cuba's just taken possession of it, and it was always technically part of Cuba. So I think it was more a sort of publicity exercise, but somebody discovered that it had been sort of not handed over, but there'd been some ceremony about East Germany having some right to it. But I loved that story, and I've seen a photo of the Ernst Thälmann bust, which got knocked over in a tropical storm and is now lying on the sand on one of the beaches there. I'll see if I can find a photo for you.
Well, I mean, if Angela Merkel is looking for something to boost her popularity in the way that Putin achieved with Crimea, perhaps she could re-annex Ernst Thälmann Island and build a bridge to it from Hamburg or something.
That's just not her style, really. So Kaliningrad you didn't get to, but you did get to some of the German Baltic coast in terms of Rügen and Lübeck. Yeah,
in Lübeck, which was effectively the easternmost city in West Germany on the inner German border. Mostly the border runs up the river Trave. So Travemünde is the resort of Lübeck, and so the east bank of the Trave was in the GDR, and the west bank was Lübeck and was in West Germany. But right at the coast, because of a quirk of administrative divisions in the 19th century, Schleswig-Holstein, where Lübeck is, stretches across at the very tip. So on the sandbank, effectively, it's only about 300 meters wide, stretches across the Trave and runs for about a mile along the coast. And so this very tiny sliver of land on the other side was fenced in all directions, and was right on the edge of the west, surrounded by East Germany and indeed by East German Navy. And what's very nice about that is that in about 1975, this place, which really just had a single road with West German holiday homes on it. West Germans went from Lübeck across a certain number and had holidays there. The part of the beach that runs right up to the old fence of the inner German border, within sight of what was then a huge watchtower, was turned into a nudist beach. And so West German nudists were lying in the sand and running into the sea, whilst nobody was allowed on the beach on the East German side apart from border police with binoculars. So that's quite a nice, and indeed if people Google it, they will be able to see some nice pictures of what that rather incongruous setup looked like.
Right. Well, we'll add those to the show note. I always think the end of the East German, West German border into the Baltic's quite an interesting one, because, you've got this beach and then the fence doesn't actually go right up to the sea, does it? There's sort of barriers and there's various different obstacles to prevent East Germans sort of getting that far down the beach, from what I remember.
That's right, yes, and it would all have been within the restricted zone and the high fencing. I believe these things changed at different points, of course, as you know, but I believe that on the actual sand it was just a chain link fence and maybe two chain link fences, so one for the West German side and one for the East German. So I think you're right that it wasn't the kind of razor wire sort of dense mesh that we think of elsewhere along the border.
Yeah, yeah. So from the Baltic, you go to Marienborn. Is that your next stop?
Yes, I drove down through and stopped at a few places. I mean, one of the things that strikes you and as you go is, different countries have invested different amounts of money in memorializing and thinking about the heritage of the Iron Curtain. And there's no question that Germany has the densest network of little museums, plaques, Gedenkstätte, the memorial sites, of which Marienborn is one of the biggest. The place, the major motorway checkpoint on the road that linked West Germany with West Berlin. But yeah, so I motored down, stopping at various places and getting out of the car and looking and being quite amazed at how in the space of 30 years, the road network has reintegrated and made the border seem like it didn't exist. The number of times you pass the signs saying that this is where the inner German border used to run is really quite striking. But I ended up having a great tour from someone who was sort of volunteering on a gap year and had learned all about the checkpoint and how it operated. I had a great tour from him one morning. And really fascinating. And fascinating as well to meet someone in their late teens who had kind of immersed themselves in the history of the Cold War, because one of the things I spotted more generally, and that lots of people working in the museum industry told me about, is, younger people have no personal recollection of the Cold War, obviously, and they don't feel it to be a highly relevant defining feature of why their life is as it is. And that's true both in the Old East and the Old West. So that was an interesting bucking of the trend to spend a morning with a younger person who has thought about all the different ways in which the Cold War is connected to the present.
And that's one of the things we're hoping to do with the podcast is to bring, some of these first-hand accounts to people who've perhaps not heard them, and to generate a feeling of realism there about it in terms of hearing it directly from that person's voice, rather than reading it from a history book or even watching a video, because I think you listen more when somebody's speaking, whereas visuals can distract from their intonation and the way that they're delivering their eyewitness account.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can understand what you're saying there. And I think as well, from having taken lots of interviews as I was traveling, it's very hard to put it into words other than by listening to a first-hand account. The combination of life was normal and yet life was really abnormal, that is the reality of the Cold War, which took so long and never resulted, or seldom resulted in Europe anyway, in actual conflict. And yet it was transformative and defined everything and overlaid everything. So I think it's only by hearing people's stories that you realize, well, life was normal and we got on with things day to day. And there were pop concerts in the West and there were pop concerts in the East, and people got married and divorced. But at the same time, this ideology and the threats and the strange compromises associated with it, they were really very, very significant for people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the border area itself is quite a nature reserve, isn't it? In a lot of places, in terms of it was, it was left on its own after the wall came down.
Yes, so I believe it is the case. I certainly was told this, but I haven't checked it myself. I believe it is the case that the last law passed by the East German Parliament, which was the rubber stamp parliament of all rubber stamp parliaments for most of its existence. But the last law that it passed was to turn the immediate restricted zone around the inner German border into a protected nature reserve. And then it went out of existence. So that was after the SED had ceased to be the only party. So it was after the only free elections in East Germany's history. But I believe that was their last a legacy to history. And since then, the European Union has become involved and has tried to turn all of the Iron Curtain corridor running right down from Norway through to Greece, I think, into the European Green Belt, one of the European protected nature areas.
Right. But in Berlin, less so, because there's valuable real estate at play there, isn't there?
In the center of Berlin, it's interesting. Because we think of the wall as iconically running through the center of the city, which it did, it's easy to forget about the other bit of the wall that ran round the back of West Berlin in order to stop people going to Potsdam, which was in the east. So I think when you go around kind of the extensive parts of where the wall was on the outskirts of West Berlin, there are a lot more areas that are nature reserve. But certainly what you're saying with regard to places like Potsdamer Platz and things, it's really truly remarkable to see how the scrubland has been transformed into a sort of neo-modern high-rise glass confection that is very, very densely packed.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Berlin in 1989 before the wall came down, and Potsdamer Platz was this just vast area of emptiness with the wall there. And when I go there now, I have difficulty orientating myself there because it's just so completely different. But yeah. Have you ever seen the film Wings of Desire by Wim Wenders?
No, I haven't.
It's a sort of art house movie, but it's a great depiction of 1980s Berlin. And there's one scene that takes place in Potsdamer Platz, which is a really good representation of what it was at the time, which is basically just derelict and waste ground on the western side, and obviously a big area of no man's land on the eastern side. I've
made a note of it and I'm going to watch it.
Yeah, no, it's one of my favourite films, and I think some of my listeners' favourite films when I've commented on it before. So well worth a watch. So, anything else that you found in Berlin?
Well, in Berlin, I did go on the trip, and I have taken other journeys there as well, and I think that's one of the places I visited actually since I did the main trip, because I went back on the 9th of November last year for the 30th anniversary commemorations of the wall coming down, and I think it was just another opportunity to see the extent to which the city has been transformed, and coming from London, where gentrification feels sort of like it has touched so many parts of the city and in such an intense way that makes it beyond the reach in many places of ordinary people. It can be hard to see that with the naked eye in Berlin to the same extent, but that is a huge concern for people there, that kind of, everywhere in the center is sort of being transformed into a global capitalist pearl, I guess, that is, has a magnetic draw, to mix my metaphors, for people from all over the world. And I certainly sensed that even as it was very moving to be present at some of the commemorations. And one of the great things about the way I mentioned already, the quality and quantity of museums looking at the Cold War across Germany, one of the great things about their approach to commemorating an event is that you can guarantee that there will be large amounts of text and photographs on boards all over the place telling you about what happened in particular places. I think one of the things that I have become increasingly interested in is the way in which during the 1980s the church in East Germany played a huge role in facilitating the wider dissident movement, the movement against the repressive state, and the church had won partly through the Helsinki Accords. The church had won some key freedoms. They weren't easy to maintain, but it had some freedoms with regard to operating its own printing presses, freedom of assembly, and they made those freedoms available to groups punk groups, computer game groups, environmental groups to meet there, even if they didn't agree with them, and that's something that I was very interested in.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting part of East German history. We did do an episode a little while back about the Stasi's infiltration of the East German church, because they absolutely recognized there was a danger there, and that's an interesting story in itself. I think one of the areas that I was very envious that you visited, amongst loads of the others, was and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, is Modlarreuth.
Mödlarreuth, yes.
Mödlarreuth, which is where the village has preserved all the border fortifications.
Yeah, it's such a crazy place. I mean, really a crazy place. I might get this wrong, but Mödlarreuth is half in Bavaria and half in Lower Saxony. I think that's correct, but no doubt someone will correct me if I'm wrong about that. And it was really on the map in Cold War times. George Bush went there, other people went there to get onto step ladders and peer across the wall that ran right through the village green, tiny village, into the east. And of course, in the east, you weren't allowed to get on a step ladder and do the same in return. It is just it's a marvelous, chilling place to see how the fortifications grew and grew. And it was called Little Berlin because they decided over time that rather than just having the typical mesh fence, which they had in most other places on the inner German border, because there were people on both sides, they needed to have a Berlin-style wall. And this wall was effectively separating 70 people on one side from probably 35 people on the other. It's really... It's chilling because it makes you realize that it was something about keeping humans apart and not even allowing people to see the West that was at the heart of this policy of fortification. Clearly, there was an economic impulse to it in terms of closing the border as fiercely as they did. But the choice of this solution in such a tiny village could only have been about obliterating the sight of the West. There was no other thing that was achieved through it. So it really is a most remarkable place.
Yeah, it's definitely on my list of places to go to next time I'm in Germany. So moving further south, you also look at the border in the Czech Republic as well.
Yeah, I spent some time traveling through the Czech Republic and Slovakia, what would have been Czechoslovakia at the time. And, I think in the north, in what was Bohemia or the Sudetenland, once again, you find yourself, as so often in the Cold War, when you're looking at the people involved, you find yourself drawn back into the pre-Second World War period, the choices and decisions and mistakes that were made then. I went to a place called Cheb, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's written Cheb, a lovely town with beautiful church in it, and everything is written everywhere in German because it was a German town for a very long time, but everyone was driven out as part of the Benesch decrees after the Second World War. And it was very interesting to spend some time there with German tourists who are coming back now, who have are the descendants of people who lived there. And that was one of several places where I realized the extent to which the Iron Curtain was a membrane that refugees had crossed over in large numbers, and especially in the the first decade of the Cold War, that refugee experience in very large numbers, not just defectors, one or two who kind of managed to slip through in dead of night, but really large numbers of people coursing in various directions across Europe. So that really came home to me. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, did you sense any sort of antagonism between the Czechs who are now living in that former German area of the Sudetenland, and these tourists coming to look at their, what they're either their former homes or their relatives' former homes.
No, I didn't. I would be lying if I said I had spent long enough there to have a good confidence that I would have, but I didn't. For instance, further north in Latvia, I did feel real tensions between the resident Latvian-speaking population and the resident Russian-speaking population. That's quite well documented, of course, more generally, but one doesn't have to be there very long to pick that up. I didn't sense the same. It seemed to me to be a sort of mutually beneficial commercial on the one hand, nostalgic and historic on the other hand transaction, and what I also heard from local people is that the fact that Schengen has opened the border and made it disappear completely, it actually creates a lot of opportunities for instance Czech people to come and work in better paid jobs in Bavaria, and for Bavarian people to buy cheap petrol, cheap opticians appointments, and so on and so forth. So on a practical day-to-day level, I think there's quite a lot of low-level cultural exchange and economic exchange on both sides of that border that seems to be happening quite naturally. That's not to say that things couldn't go bad or there aren't tensions beneath the surface, but it did seem to me to be fundamentally working well.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's quite a lot of areas around Europe that have those echoes of past times where the borders have moved quite significantly. Areas like East Prussia, which is now part of Poland and part of Russia now, and Silesia and Pomerania, which are now parts of Poland, and obviously the Sudetenland, which was never a proper part of Germany apart from during the Nazi era when they annexed it and then took over Czechoslovakia. But no, interesting to hear that.
Just on that subject, you just remind me, there's you may have heard of a German novelist. He died a few years ago, called Walter Kempowski, and his books have more recently been translated into English. So they were written maybe 10, 20 years ago, but they've only been published recently. And one of his books, and the name escapes me now, so very unhelpful, but one of his books is about a group of West Germans going on holiday to the formerly German parts of Poland during the Cold War. So there were even package holidays, tours arranged to allow former refugees from Silesia, Pomerania to go back and see their homeland in the 1980s. But what's interesting about the book is that quite a lot of it is about the hostility that each side feels towards the other, and the difficulties and name calling and casting up of difficult historical moments. So I was very interested to discover that kind of tourism had been possible even during the Cold War.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard of sort of Warsaw Pact exercises where there was no love lost between the East German army and the Polish army, or they were very competitive. Obviously because of past history. So we've talked to, you mentioned Vienna earlier. What sort of Cold War remnants did you find in Vienna?
Well, the best ones are the ones that you just stumble upon, and there are two places in the center of Vienna where there is Russian graffiti from 1945 just on the walls in the street.
Wow.
And I know. I shan't say exactly where they are, but they are literally right in the heart of the tourist district. And if any of your listeners are there or go there, then do hunt for the two pieces of Soviet graffiti. They were official graffiti. So basically, when the Soviets occupied Vienna, when they liberated Vienna from the Nazis, they divided the center of the city into quarters. I believe, I want to say 24, but it might be 28. and systematically they moved through each quarter looking for known Nazi suspects, people that they wanted to arrest or indeed to shoot. And they went through every house, every staircase, every alleyway looking. And when they had completed the searches in one particular quarter, the person in charge would stencil on the wall, first quarter checked, second quarter checked. And two of those survive right in the center of Vienna, just above head height. That was quite a joy to find those. There's a little bit about them on the internet that I discovered subsequently because I was just wondering, are they genuine and what do they mean? It's quite a strange phrase, second quarter checked, but really not very much. So that's definitely something to look out for.
So did you just stumble across these, or did somebody give you a
genuinely
pointer? Wow.
No, I know. So lots of things were sort of things I'd set out to go and see because I'd sort of been genning up on things, but those were genuine finds.
Because another one of my favourite films is The Third Man. Did you go on the Third Man tour?
I didn't make it on the Third Man tour because of just the days that I was in. I was on there off season, and I think they were only running the tour on Saturdays, and so I couldn't. I wasn't able to go.
So you're then into Budapest and Sopron, and did you visit the location of the Pan-European picnic?
I did indeed.
Good.
I went to Sopron and cycled out to the location of the Pan-European picnic, where very touching event, obviously. But amusingly, that's one place where there are about 5 different archaeological layers of information for tourists, sort of some that was put up very quickly afterwards, some from the 90s, some from the early 2000s, some from the European Union, some from the local area. So it's a very storied place, and yet it's really, really in the middle of nowhere. So you sort of suddenly come upon this field, and there's layer after layer of information about the Pan-European picnic that took place there. And then at the end of the field, there is still the Austrian-Hungarian border, which is one of the borders that since 2015 has been, since the refugee crisis in Europe in 2015, has been manned again. So even though it is in Schengen and effectively therefore doesn't exist, it nonetheless, there are Austrian border guards there all the time, ready to check cars and buses.
And then you travel down to Tirana and the rest of Albania, to near the island of Corfu.
That's right. So I spent some time in Tirana. Spent a lot of time underground in Tirana, of course. Albania famous for its many bunkers, and I spent quite a lot of time underground looking at bunkers furnished with Chinese equipment to create an oxygen supply and keep things running from the era when Enver Hoxha was friendly with the Chinese, but not with any of the European communist powers. And then I made my way by bus on a really spectacular route through the mountains to Sarandë, which is the little port, now a nice holiday resort, that is a mile or so from Corfu. So that's another slightly unexpected place, perhaps not for your listeners, many of whom are very knowledgeable, but certainly for lots of my friends and acquaintances, quite surprising to discover that the Iron Curtain runs down that very narrow channel between Albania and Corfu. But the site of a very significant early Cold War altercation when 2 British naval ships were basically destroyed by Albanian mines, with the loss of 44 British sailors.
Yeah, that's right. It's a relatively unknown incident in the Cold War, but we didn't do too well with Albania because Philby, I think, betrayed various operations to try and infiltrate people into Albania as well during the early Cold War. That's
right, and actually that that activity, whether specifically the operations Philby was involved in or other operations, that was the Albanian defense for blowing up the British naval ships. So they said, there had been hostile activity by the British, and they were just taking defensive action.
Yeah,
the British said that it was the open sea, and so it was a war crime to mine the open sea and not allow a ship to keep the Corfu Channel open. It was actually the very first case to be taken at The Hague. The criminal court that was set up after the Second World War.
right.
The conclusion was in Britain's favour, but it would seem from what I've read that historical opinion would say that Britain had been very lucky because it withheld a lot of evidence on the grounds of national security that would have played to the Albanian case.
Right. Yeah, you might be interested. I did an episode a few weeks back, which was somebody who visited Albania in 1989 for a holiday. And he gives quite a good description of what Tirana was like. This was post-Hodja, but before the fall of the communist regime there. But you might find that interesting for a listen, because he also travels down to the Albanian coast, and he can see Corfu across the water as well. So
that's great. Did he have to shave a beard off on arrival?
No, he didn't mention that. That was a detail he didn't mention. So I presume he was clean shaven when
you weren't allowed to have a beard, and they had hairdressers at the airport. Who would, I guess they didn't forcibly shave you, but you weren't allowed in unless you visited those hairdressers if you had non-compliant facial hair.
Wow. Okay. A little gem of Cold War information we didn't know there. So you cross over to Corfu, and then it's North Macedonia?
Yeah, so I went to Corfu to understand a bit, partly to visit the British cemetery there where the victims of the Corfu Channel incident are buried, and to talk to a few people. And then I went by bus across Greece to Thessalonica, and from there up to North Macedonia, which had only recently changed its name when I was visiting. Actually, while I was there, I did try and understand what the border had been like in Cold War times, but I also visited the border right up against the border today, where sort of new fences have been erected since 2015, not dissimilar to the very dense mesh that we would associate with the inner German border, all to prevent or try to prevent the movement of refugees from Greece up through into parts of the European Union further north. And I spent a day at a refugee camp just inside North Macedonia, trying to understand the story of 2015 and what had happened since. Very interesting. If you think of the context of what we assume about the Cold War, that principally people were trying to get out of the East into the West. Certainly not so true with regard to Yugoslavia as it would have been with regard to other countries. But nonetheless, we think of that movement in general. And then you fast forward to 2015 and you have the now the North Macedonian government erecting a fence to keep people in Greece and prevent them from coming into Macedonia. So just a very interesting reversal.
Yes, absolutely. So then you're into Turkey and towards the end of your travels.
That's right. I went to Istanbul partly because it's hard to move through Turkey from west to east without hitting Istanbul, partly because, and I'm not sure yet whether I'll focus on this in the book, but the Bosphorus itself was a flashpoint in the Cold War, and there was a concerted effort by the Soviet government to try to internationalize the Bosphorus and take it away from Turkish control at the end of the Second World War. because obviously it is the only way in and out of the Black Sea, and therefore it gives Turkey a lot of theoretical control over how Soviet navy ships and trade vessels move to and from those southern ports. So I may look at that or I may not in the book, but jolly nice to spend a few days in Istanbul. And then I moved much further to the east, back towards the Soviet border, to visit Kars, the city closest to Georgia and Armenia, and then to go to Nakhchivan province, the bit of Azerbaijan that is not connected to the rest of Azerbaijan, and that's where I finished. I should say that I've spent quite a lot of time in my life in Georgia and Armenia. I lived in Georgia for a year, and because of time pressure and one thing and another, I decided to postpone traveling to Georgia and Armenia until April 2020 and to go back and look at them as part of the trip. So I should be there at the moment that I'm speaking to you, but instead I'm speaking to you from London, and we'll have to go again.
We'll look forward to hearing how you get on there. Now, I think we said at the start, you're turning your trip into a book. How is that going?
Well, it's going really well, in that I'm loving writing about it. At the moment of speaking to you, we're both very restricted in our movements. And so there's an added pleasure to remembering when I was considerably more mobile and going to places that very few people get to go to, and traveling to new cities or countries every few days, because at the moment I tend to travel to Tesco's every few days, and that's about it. So there's something really nice about writing about it and remembering it at the moment. I have another job, so this writing is it's much more than a hobby, but it's only part of my life. So I guess I make slower progress than I would like, but at the moment I'm planning to have the manuscript finished sometime in the first half of 2021, and hopefully the book is under contract to Granta, and hopefully they will turn it around and get it out later that year.
Right, and will the book contain photos as well?
Yes, I took an impressive amount of photos, so much so that my laptop can't really hold anymore. And one of the pleasures of writing each chapter, especially if I hit a bit of writer's block, is going into my trove of photos and trying to select the most arresting images. At the minute, I think they'll probably be in black and white, but if people are interested in seeing some of the images, I have an Instagram account called Curtain and Wall. So all one word, Curtain and Wall. And I've already posted quite a few there, images from the trip, which will give people a flavour of some of the places we've talked about, but also some of the other ones we haven't.
And we have further photos, videos and information on this episode in our show notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Don't forget, if you'd like to get one of those Cold War Conversations coasters, help keep us on the air, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. And if you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group, where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.